want to welcome everybody to the Brookline League of Women Voters Friday discussion. Our topic today is Brookline and Massachusetts Home Rule. However, first, just looking ahead briefly, I want to let everybody be reminded that Wednesday, October 20th, we will be holding the open meeting online. It's an annual event held by the League of Women Voters, and we'll be hosting a presentation on the history of Brookline government as it was incorporated in 1705 with local historians Ken Liss of the Brookline Historical Society and Greer Hardwick, who is currently engaged in writing a history of women in Brookline and has had several exhibits of that, and also recently in the Brookline Library. So more to come on that subject. Today, we'll have an overview of Brookline municipal legislation as it is subject to the home rule process in the legislature. Because Brookline has not enacted a charter which establishes local governing authority, the town must submit requests to enact certain local regulations through the legislature. The Massachusetts home rule process can be confusing, and Town Administrator Mel Kleckner will provide us with an overview of the types of municipal legislation that are subject to home rule by the legislature. Typically, they're bylaw amendments, some direct home rule petitions, and others. There are multiple articles requiring home rule on the warrant for the town meeting in November. In particular, Articles 10, 11, and 12 that deal with remote public meetings carrying forward. Tommy Vitolo, a Brookline resident, has been our state representative since 2019. He will discuss the various next steps required by the state before the local legislation can be finally approved. Representative Vitolo is vice chair of the Joint Committee on Election Laws, working to ensure that our election system is free, fair, and easily accessible for all eligible citizens. And this year, that work included extending the COVID-19 voting provisions. He also serves on the House Committee on Steering, Policy, and Scheduling, the Joint Committee on Elder Affairs, and the Joint Committee on Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development. After the presentations, our speakers will take your questions. Please put questions into the chat. And now, first, we will hear from Town Administrator Mel Kleckner. Welcome, Mel, and thank you for helping us walk through this process.
Thank you, Betsy, and good morning, everyone, and happy to be here with Representative Tommy Vitolo talking about home rule and home rule petitions. It can seem very complicated, and it is. I want to first start with a concept that was drilled into me in graduate school as I was learning about our federal system of government and how federal, state, and local government work. And it was very clear concept in our federal system of government that municipal governments are creatures of the state, and that was the terminology that was used. But local governments only exist by virtue of the state government, and that is even in our federal constitution. There's no mention of local government in the federal constitution, but in our state constitution, as Betsy mentioned, we have evolved to deal with the Home Rule Amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But it's really important to know that even with the so-called home rule concept out there, there are just so many things that municipal government need special permission or a variance from an existing state law, that home rule petitions are just going to be part of our process going forward. They are, and they have been, and they will continue to be. I know Tommy will talk a little bit about the concern from the legislature's point of view of being sort of overwhelmed by these petitions, which some of them are very, very modest but some of them are very significant and have statewide consequences. But anyway, So home rule, which is a concept, but it's also an amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution, as I mentioned. It's Article 87 of the amendments to the Massachusetts Constitution. And as Betsy mentioned, it wasn't even adopted until the 1960s. So, Brookline has been around since 1705, even long before our country was formed. And so you can imagine how Brookline has evolved over these 300 years or more, and just the sheer volume of laws and special acts, and many of them home rule petitions that the town itself has initiated since 1705, that just form our charter, if you will, since the town has not adopted a charter. Our charter is just this combination of general laws beginning in 1705 to many, many special acts, and also our bylaws. The Home Rule Amendment allows us to adopt bylaws to govern ourselves as long as they're not inconsistent with state laws. So our charter is effectively this accumulation of all these things, and it's very complicated. And I advocate for, at least for us to sort of put it in one place. The one law that we have, which I would say resembles a charter more than anything, is the Town Administrator Act of the town. And that was a home rule petition that was submitted and adopted by the legislature back in 1986. And it's only about a page long, but it really is the one place that really fundamentally, it established a town administrator's position, but it also really fundamentally talks about the roles of the select board versus the town administrator. It is really the one law I would say that fundamentally establishes the executive and administrative governance of the town. And by the way, there is an article on the upcoming special town meeting warrant that seeks to amend that. So obviously, if you create a home rule petition, if you need to amend it, it needs to go back through the home rule petition. And in this case, the select board is seeking to delegate some of their licensing authority. Yet in the Town Administrator Act, there is an explicit provision which says the select board shall not delegate its licensing authority. So obviously, we have to go back to the legislature and seek their authority to allow the select board to do that, perhaps through a licensing subcommittee or some other mechanism. Now there is this charter reform process, and as that is part of the Home Rule Amendment. It allows cities and towns to, by themselves, without going back to the legislature, to create their own form of government through a charter commission process. There are some communities who don't use the process, even when they can. They might just go through a committee process and create a home rule petition, get their town meeting to approve it, and create a charter in that manner. Many towns have done that. But if they don't want to go back through the legislative process, the Home Rule Amendment does allow a city or town to create their own charter through this process. Chapter 43B is the Home Rule Procedures Act, and it gets into a lot more detail. So in addition to charter reform or creating charters, the other part of Home Rule says that communities can adopt their own bylaws and to how they want their municipality to be governed, or to be how they want to manage their affairs. The problem is that that Home Rule petition says that the Home Rule Procedures Act says, as long as that bylaw is not inconsistent with some state law. Well, let me tell you, since 1705, there's a lot of state laws that have been passed, and one of the things in town management we learn is that if you don't see a state law that is restricting your ability, you haven't looked hard enough. And I can assure you, there are so many times when somebody has said, "Well, we could obviously do that. There's nothing like that says we can't." Well, let me tell you, we find more often than not that there is some arcane special act. I'll tell you a little funny story. So you remember a couple of years ago, the city of Boston eliminated Bunker Hill Day as a holiday, a day off. And so it was in our contracts, it was in our labor contracts that our employees wanted that. And so once the state law got changed and Bunker Hill Day was eliminated, we said, okay, well, let's just bargain with our employees. And we did. We bargained and said, we don't want to use this day. Maybe I think we created maybe a floating holiday or some phase out or something. But lo and behold, we found a state law that said, a home rule petition that created Bunker Hill Day as a holiday for our employees in Brookline, Massachusetts. So, you never know. And so I know Tommy's going to talk about this. We use the home rule petition as a way, I call it like clearing title. You know how you can get in a real estate transaction, there may be impediments on the title, and you kind of do kind of a cleanup of the clearing the title and getting a new title. And that's the way I find the home rule petition is often used. We don't know what the laws are, but we sure don't want to find ourselves in the situation in litigation in the future or in conflict with another law. So let's ask the legislature to kind of clean it up and create a new law. They use the notwithstanding any other state or, state law or special act. That's the cleanup language. Frankly, I'm sure Tommy doesn't love that, and we don't love that either. But the home rule petition really does create some issues for us. And then the other one is that there are a lot of state laws that restrict local government, and they're very widely known. So, for example, open meeting law. One of the articles on our warrant coming up is an approach at hybrid meetings, so that we wouldn't have to have a physical quorum present in the meeting. We can use more remote technology, which has become so ubiquitous in the pandemic era. We can't do that because the open meeting law of the state restricts that. So we're looking to create a unique, exemption for the town to do that. I know Tommy's going to talk about those things too, which really are, really have statewide implications. So with that, I'm going to stop and let Tommy go and talk a little bit about the process. And I'm happy to talk about any questions you may have about how it works from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mel. And I'm sure we will have questions. So moving forward then, Tommy, I'm hoping that you are not only prepared to explain anything that might come up from Brookline, but just sort of in general, what the legislative home rule process involves. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Betsy. Can you give me some sense for how long you'd like me to speak before taking a break and opening the conversation?
Certainly, you've got a good 15 minutes plus
Okay.
or minus, so your call.
I'll do my best. It's a long and complicated conversation. But I'm going to start by holding up my somewhat famous little piece of paper. This is me. I'm Tommy Vitolo. My cell phone is 617-872-8921. I've just turned the ringer off since I'm speaking with you, and I know how to do that. So please feel free to call when I can be helpful. And if I can't take the call now, I'll call you back. My email is tommy.vitolo@mahouse.gov. That's a great email if you want to engage with me in my role as a state representative. If you want to say, hey, let's go out for drinks, call me. I'd love to join you, but probably save the State House email for the kinds of things that belong on the State House mail server. As Mel began to explain, and there are entire law courses dedicated to this topic, the state constitution prohibits the legislature from writing laws specific to an individual municipality. The concept really comes from protecting municipalities from obnoxious potential decisions made by the legislature that would unfairly penalize or otherwise treat one community from the others. Since then, following the Dillon case, which I think was about 100 years ago, and then the constitutional amendments that Mel mentioned, we've kind of turned it on its head a little bit and said, wait a minute, there are circumstances when an individual municipality has something unusual about it that requires a tweak in state law because the general policy that the legislature created isn't a good fit for this particular community for a particular reason. And so we need a way to say, okay, that's the policy statewide, but in this particular municipality, on this really specific issue, we'd like to do it a little bit differently. And that's what the home rule is for. And so there's really a few different kinds of home rules. The kind of home rule petition that has the most attention in state law relates to the charter. And so if the town of Brookline has a charter, and it is the rules that govern how the municipal government operates, municipal elections and positions, and similar sorts of rules. And these charters have all been approved by the state legislature. And there's 351 cities and towns. There are 351 different charters. Many of them have very similar rules. For example, all cities hold their general election on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, often on odd numbered years, but that's consistent. For towns, we don't all have our election on the first Tuesday in May, as Brookline does. Some have them a little earlier, some have them a little bit later, and that's sort of up to the charter. If a municipality wants to change its charter, it does it through a home rule. Clearly, that is specific to that community because it's that community's charter, right? And so there are cases where Brookline has done this or will do this in the future. There was a conversation, it was not moved, but there was a Warrant article that proposed a mechanism for recall elections. Well, that's in the charter. That would be a home rule. And that's whether or not you think the policy is a good policy, it's a good home rule. There's no other mechanism to achieve that. Other communities have done it. The legislature has seen this before. That makes for a good home rule. We also see home rules for things like, let's name this bridge owned by DCR or MassDOT after a soldier who was tragically killed overseas, right? A specific bridge in a specific place. That's also appropriate for a home rule. You're not naming every bridge, you're naming one specific bridge. And because it's a state-owned bridge, the state has to agree to do it. The mechanism for that is often a home rule, right? There are some islands in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard who are proposing home rules to prohibit mopeds and Vespas. Now, it turns out that life on the islands is substantially different from life on the mainland. And mopeds and Vespas have a very different interaction with these small number of communities than they do with the rest of the state. In my view, that's an appropriate home rule. The reason why all three of these examples are similar is this idea that is in law called substantially local in nature. The question is the thing that we are considering specifically relevant to your community and perhaps several others? Or is this really something that is a state policy, but you're not a state legislature, so you don't get to do that. You have to ask the state legislature instead. The legislature, to be clear, has latitude and is always going to make decisions that are inconsistent with prior decisions and inconsistent with trends and inconsistent with what we've done since, the late 1700s. So I cannot tell you what the legislature would do with any particular home rule, whether or not it is substantially local in nature. I cannot predict the future. And I want to emphasize that I will not publicly comment on home rule proposals that are warrants, that are warrant articles in the warrant, and I will abstain from all votes on those. If the town wants to pursue a particular warrant article, the town needs to make that decision through town government. and I will essentially take my marching orders from the town. If the town wants a home rule petition, I will file it and I will advocate for it. But not all home rule petitions will be received equally by the great and general court. Home rule petitions that are substantially local in nature, that the legislature has seen before from other communities, where the language is sort of run of the mill, and that aren't policy discussions currently ongoing in the legislature, have a much stronger chance to be passed by the legislature than home rule petitions that fail any one or several of those criteria. Again, the legislature, every once in a while it'll zig when everyone thought it would zag, but to be really clear, home rules that are designed to pass, where the intent is for them to become law, we have a pretty good way of weighing the chance of success. And even the simplest home rules take a tremendous amount of effort. And I see Janice Kahn on the call. She remembers several years ago, we had a home rule petition that would simply move 2 liquor licenses from Washington Square into Coolidge Corner or Brookline Village. Doesn't change the number of licenses, right? Just moves them. This is about as minor a request as someone could imagine. And in addition to all the time that town staff and advisory committee, and particularly under the leadership of people of Janice in particular, right? In addition to that amount of time, I personally spent about 80 hours getting that home rule passed, and my staff spent an additional 40, right? The most valuable resource I have in my office is time. The town passed this home rule. It was achievable in the legislature. It met all of the criteria, right? Sufficiently local in nature, prior art, right? Not dabbling in policy that the legislature is currently discussing, and it still took a substantial amount of resource to get passed, right? And by the way, I had a chair, the House Chair of Professional Licensure, Taki Chan, who was engaged and interested in being helpful, right? We had everything going for us, and it still took a substantial amount of effort. And that's because legislating is hard work. Getting everything exactly right and making sure to the best we can we're consistent with everything we've done prior and everything we see coming takes a lot of effort, right? So all of this is to say, right, Brookline has approximately 8 home rule petitions kind of filed already and circulating in the legislature, and is considering roughly another 5 or 6. And just like everybody else, I only have 8,760 hours a year, and I sleep for some of them, and I spend time with family for some of them. And some of my time on the job, I'm not working on home rules. I'm doing constituent services. I'm working on general legislation, right? I'm serving as the vice chair of election law, something I know the League of Women Voters is very interested in, right? So there's a time limitation, and I think it's important to be thoughtful of that. And it's not just my time limitation. If you're the chair of municipalities, you've got 500 bills before your committee in this 2-year cycle. Many of them affect all 351 cities and towns, and a few of them affect one town. Now, where do you think it's appropriate for you to spend most of your time as the chair of municipalities? I think you probably, I've never been a chair, I'm a vice chair, so I don't want to speak for any chair, but I think it's probable that the chairs spend most of their time focusing on general laws that affect all 351 cities and towns, because frankly, it's probably a more appropriate decision to invest your time helping as many people as possible, right? So I think it's really important to understand all of this framing when we talk about home rules. We should ask for what we want as a town. We should be really specific and ask for what we want, but we should also understand that there's lots of other demands on the legislature, and we as a body have to figure out how to allocate our time fairly and appropriately. Asking for things that are very unlikely to occur may not be the best use of our community's time or the legislature's time. And so I think that it's important that we're thoughtful and we ask for what we want. I have heard expressed in advisory committee, subcommittee, public meetings, pushback on some proposed home rules. And I've heard the petitioner say, well, sure, this really should just be a state law. But this is the best way for Brookline to signal to the legislature that this should be a state law. It is my personal view as a state legislator that that view is dead wrong. Dead wrong. If the town thinks the legislature should pass a law for all 351 cities and towns, changing state law, then what we ought to do is ask for that, in my view. And the way that we would ask for that is through a resolution that town meeting would pass saying, hey, state legislature, we think you should change the state law about XYZ in this particular way, because we think that would allow us to be more efficient as a government. We think that would allow us to do a better job representing constituents, whatever the reason. And then, of course, you're going to want to, make sure you copy that to Representative Tommy Vitolo, Representative Mike Moran, Representative Coppinger, Representative Nika Elugardo, and Senator Cynthia Cream, the 5 legislators who represent Brookline. I believe that is my view, that is a better approach if the goal is to change state law. And that's especially relevant in cases where the home rule is not substantially local in nature, because I believe it is incredibly unlikely that the legislature will even spend more than a few minutes considering a home rule that is not substantially local in nature, because these are the standards by which we have operated since at least the 1960s, when this ability to legislate home rules became a reality for us. And so again, I will defer to town meeting and let town meeting make its decision as a legislature, and I will serve as I am asked, but I am hopeful that town meeting recognizes that there are home rules that are likely to succeed, and there are home rules that are going to have a much harder time even being seriously considered. And that's because there are some home rules that fit the mold for an appropriate home rule, and there are some home rules that are proposed from Brookline and other communities that really don't. The legislature hates to say no. So instead, we just kind of don't return the phone call sometimes. We send it to study, we don't engage. And sometimes that's because we're really busy and there's just too much going on and we didn't get to it. And sometimes that's because we're being polite. And we don't want to say no, but if you do your homework, you're going to see the answer is almost certainly no. And so I'm happy to answer questions about home rules. We have successfully passed one in my term as office, and this was the liquor license one we talked about. I'm very optimistic that we're making progress on the Colonel Floyd home rule, which relates to sub-bids in a construction project. This is like super bureaucratic stuff for a affordable housing development that is a really wonderful project, but requires a specific tweak or a specific exemption from a particular bidding law for this specific project in this specific location in Brookline. Again, substantially local in nature. And then there's some other home rules that we're working on that seem to be moving a little more slowly. And perhaps that's because the chairs are very busy and legislating is hard, or perhaps that's because the chairs are being polite. It kind of depends on which home rule we're talking about. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I've only been a rep 2.5 years. I'm still learning about home rules. There's no handbook for employees who happen to be state representatives and state senators. There's an ethics book, but there's not like here's all the other stuff. You just got to kind of learn it as you go. And so I'm actively learning as much as I can, but I still, of course, have much more to learn. But I'm happy to share with you what I've learned so far. I think this is a good time to break for questions. Mel's got his hand up.
I would love to ask Mel to comment. And subsequently, I just want to identify there are 2 items coming before town meeting that are different in character with regard to home rule. And I'd like to use them as illustrations. Listen to Mel, but the 2 examples I have in mind, and Mel mentioned one, which is delegating licensing authority of the select board, which seems like one of the more simple, straightforward kind. And the other one is a request to authorize the town to hold hybrid town meetings, public meetings, which I think is much more complicated and would be much more broadly applicable across Massachusetts. So Mel, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Betsy. And
unmute.
yeah, I'm there. Thanks, Betsy, and thanks, Tommy. I learned a lot, and I think, it was important to hear what he's saying because, we can think Brookline may be running the show, but we don't. And it's the legislature with 351 cities and towns represented. So it's not as simple. And I also spent a lot of time on home rule bills that are sort of chasing your tail. But I did want to respond to one thing that was in the question. I think it was from Donna, and she thought her question was answered, but I didn't hear one part of that I think is important. And really the question was, are there any differences between towns and cities as it relates to home rule, generally speaking? And there is one important thing. I may have mentioned this before. When a town passes a bylaw, we call them bylaws, which are authorized by home rule, you can create your own bylaws as long as they don't interfere with state law. But there is a procedure that towns use that cities do not when they pass what they refer to as ordinances. They're the same thing, they're local laws. We have to seek Attorney General approval of all of our bylaws because we are a town form of government. A city form of government does not need to do that for an ordinance. And I think that is an interesting hurdle because often when we pass local bylaws, a lot of the times our debate is, well, what will the Attorney General do? What will the Attorney General say, and how will this impact us? Cities don't do that. They just say, well, we're going to pass this, and we'll see how it goes if anybody litigates it or whatever. But we have this secondary hurdle that has to get Attorney General approval for all of our local bylaws. Going back to the questions or the issues on the town meeting warrant, I put them in buckets. So I think that clearly this hybrid meeting thing, I think it's well intentioned, and I definitely think there needs to be reform and to the way our open meeting law works. But I think it's probably one of those situations that Tommy talks about is really not very unique to Brookline. I mean, how are we unique in our meetings? Although maybe we are because we are so progressive and active in our community, perhaps. But that's one of them. The other one has to do with that provision of the Town Administrator Act about licensing authority, and I think that sounds to me like one of them that's in Tommy's good bucket. It's a relatively unique issue. It's subject to a home rule petition in the first place. You have to amend that. And then there's the other one, which is civil service revocation for the police. And quite honestly, that is the one in the category of clearing the title. The town adopted civil service back in the 1890s. And then over the next 100 years, we were taking positions in, taking positions out, doing this, doing that. And although it's true that you can remove yourself from civil service or other state laws in the same manner that you accepted them in the first place, it's a little confusing because when Brookline accepted it, we were open town meeting, and then subsequently became a representative town meeting. So there's a lot of issues that our town council, and we're using a special counsel in this case, says, oh, go to the legislature. You got to clean this up. You got to have this one authorization from the legislature through a home rule petition. And I'm sure that's frustrating when if the town could do it themselves. But those are the kind of three buckets. I put those different. They're all home rule petitions, but they're sort of motivated and they fall into different categories, I think, especially given the way Tommy has outlined them. Thank you.
So, Representative Vitolo, what do you do with these things?
That's a great question. And there's both a technical answer and a softer answer. The technical answer is that when the town meeting approves a home rule, the next step is that the select board must mail in hard copy with raised seal a very specific letter to several different people in the State House. They have to mail it to the House clerk, Stephen James, the Senate clerk, whose name I don't know because I'm not in the Senate, so I just try to stay away. And they send copies to us. And it is only at that point that a legislator, it would be myself or Senator Cream, we sort of take turns and try to figure out who's best for each home rule, can file it. We're not allowed, we the legislators are not allowed to file a home rule without raised seal proof that the town wants it. I can't just file a home rule for the town for something that I want. The town has to go through the process first. And so once we get those letters from the town, then I or Senator Cream would file the home rule. Now, the town calendar is obviously very different than the state legislative calendar. Our bills are timely filed when they are filed in January of odd numbered years. That is the time, the month that it's really only 2 weeks that we have to file bills on time. But we can file bills late, and it's a good thing because sometimes pandemics creep along unexpectedly and you need to respond. You can't wait until the next 2-year cycle, right? And home rules are the kind of a late file that's reasonably expected, right? Because we, the legislature, understand that individual communities don't operate on the same calendar we do. So we get the home rule, we file it as a late file, and then it sits in a committee until we pry it out and get it assigned. Sits in sort of a rules committee until we pry it out and get it assigned to a topical committee like professional licensure or municipalities or public service. Those are 3 committees that often get home rules. And then it has to be scheduled for hearing, just like any other bill, has to have a hearing. As long as we're still like in the first 12 to 18 months of the legislative cycle that begins in January of the odd numbered year, there's a chance we can get the home rule done. If it's filed in the last like 6 or 8 months of the year, the committee's already finished working on bills. They will not pass it, but I can then, or Senator Cream can then file it again next session, timely, and sort of get in that process, right? The legislature committees of the legislature don't sit around waiting for home rules so that they can then study the home rules really carefully and work on them. We're working on a lot of things. Home rules are one part of it. And we have our 2-year cycle. And so, and that's important. There were one home rule in particular I can think of. Brookline passed a home rule asking for permission to essentially tax, they called it a fee, certain deed transfers, right, when you sell a home, and use that money for affordable housing. And the timing of that meant it sort of was filed too near the end of last session. So the committee just sort of said, no, we're sorry, we're not really going to spend any time on it. But I was able to refile it. So now we're working on it this session. And like any other bill, a home rule has 2 years to make it through or it's dead. There are ways to refile it and try again, thankfully. But at the end of a 2-year cycle, if it is not the law, it goes back to go. It does not collect $200, right? And that's the process. In practice, the way the legislature works, and this should not be surprising. If you're surprised, rethink your understanding of people a little bit. Legislating is not so much a technical process. It is a process of relationships and conversations and working together as a team, right? So yes, there is a technical nature. We have to make sure that the proposed law is legal, that it fits the framework of MGL, that it passes state and federal constitutional muster, right? There is technical work to be done. Legislators don't do that work. Staff, who's much more capable, does that work, right? We do the policy, and that comes from conversations. And so that's why home rules, just like any other bill, take so long, because they require meetings and conversations and then reviews and then more meetings to make sure that it's the right thing at the right time. And so a large part of any bill, including a home rule, is having those relationships and having those conversations. And remember, right, Lori Ehrlich is the House Chair of Municipalities, and she's wonderful, and she's a great friend to so many. I cannot ask for an hour of her time every day of the week. I can't. She has 158 other colleagues, right? And so there becomes bottlenecks because there's only so much time that we all have. And so because legislation requires these conversations, and because the amount of these conversations that any two people can have is naturally limited, it becomes impossible for the legislature to pass all of the excellent bills that are before us in a session. Even if you just limit to all the bills that are amazing, we don't have enough time to do all of them because each one takes so much time from so many people.
Tommy, I would have
so that's the process.
Try to pin you down a little bit on, and one of the examples that we gave, which I think is likely to be much more broader in its impact, and frankly, to the legislature as well. And the question is about holding hybrid meetings. Currently, I mean, you and the legislature have had your own challenges dealing with the pandemic and not being able to be in person. And yet there are laws in the books that say thou shalt do various things in order to hold one of these meetings in order for it to have legal and official status. So is the legislature likely to be looking at those as a broader category?
So currently, state law has suspended the open meeting law as known and the representative town meeting laws as known pre-pandemic, and said on a temporary basis, we are going to relax the requirements of being in person, either in town meeting in its entirety or for boards, committees, and commissions. It's permitted to be entirely virtual or hybrid to any fraction or entirely in person. That's the community's decision. Those laws are temporary and they will expire. As Delta sort of flattens out but doesn't go down, which seems to be about where we are now, it's unclear if the legislature will believe that we need to extend those COVID era regulations because we believe COVID will continue. I'm hopeful that we can let them lapse because we're past COVID, right? I don't know what the future holds. But the conversation is also had begun because the Delta variant hadn't arrived yet. We had begun talking about, okay, what happens after COVID? What have we learned from entirely Zoom meetings or other methods that we can keep post-COVID? And the legislature is actively debating in the hallways, so to speak, several bills related to representative town meeting and open meeting law for boards, committees, and commissions that would impact, in the former case, every community that's representative town meeting, which is several dozen, and in the latter case, all 351 cities and towns.
Okay, so even without the warrant article that Brookline is proposing, this is under discussion at the legislature where action could be taken. And so this just becomes one more request in the list that the legislature is discussing. And I'm just trying to put it into context, Tommy, that's all.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, there's a little bit of nuance I want to make clear. Look, there's 5,000 bills. So one could make the case that we're discussing everything all the time, right? I mean, there's 5,000 bills, maybe closer to 6,000. So that's not the standard by which I'm expressing there's conversation in the legislature.
No, I was really thinking more that you might have multiple requests and therefore it makes sense for the legislature to debate this particular issue broadly as you have as you've explained it. How it
the legislature is debating it broadly, but not because we've had 0 or 1 or 3 or however many number of requests. We're debating it broadly because the issue clearly impacts all 351 cities and towns.
Okay.
And it's topical and it's really meaningful. It's clearly, you know, is it as high a priority as vaccine mandates at the moment? No, it's not. But we do more than one thing at a time. And it is clearly within the realm of something coming up, something important to many, something directly relevant to our democracy, which is something that the legislators themselves are very passionate about. So yeah, I think it's the several bills relating to this topic are not likely to see the same fate as the vast majority of the other 5,000, which is to say there'll be a quiet hearing, there'll be a few pieces of testimony, and they'll be sent to study. I think these are getting much more activity than that.
We'll be hearing about what the broader decisions will be going forward, coming out of the legislature, we hope.
Possibly, it's to be clear, it's possible that we do nothing, right? In fact, the legislature is very good at not acting on things, right? We don't act on most of the things. There are 5,000 bills. Most of them will not become law. We're good at not doing things. It's hard to do things, and I'm hopeful that we will do something regarding meetings and public access in the coming session. And I certainly am in favor of making some changes there.
Okay. I don't have any more questions in the chat. Well, actually, there is one more. Are there criteria that give a municipality a greater chance of having a home rule accepted and passed? In other words, is there a particular set of criteria that you would use in evaluating a home rule petition?
Well, so again, I remind folks that I can speak in generalities, but the legislature is always free to and occasionally does zig when everyone thought it would zag, right? So these shouldn't be taken as absolutist in any way. But sort of to think back to what I said earlier, it's much more likely if the home rule is substantially local in nature, if that language has passed in a home rule before, right? There's prior art, and if it's not if it's not a policy issue that's actively being discussed statewide. That doesn't mean that if you meet those three criteria, it will pass. And it doesn't mean that if you fail any of those criteria, it won't pass. But in my view, those are some of the lenses through which the legislators. I would add another one, and that's urgency. And this relates a little bit to what the town administrator said with title clearance. Sometimes it's like the home rule needs to pass by this date, or the consequences cannot be reversed. So for example, with the Colonel Floyd home rule, we're gonna build the housing. If we pass this home rule, we will be able to build the housing at a higher quality and at a lower cost, we believe. If the home rule doesn't pass by a certain time, we're gonna build the housing anyway, and it will cost us more money and it will be lower quality. And the home rule will now become useless because we will have sort of passed the point of no return. And so sometimes urgency helps things get done. That's true in all of our lives. It's also true in the legislature. But of course, sometimes urgent things don't get done, and then you've lost that opportunity entirely. There's no going back. But I would add urgency as a factor that I think is an important one that committee chairs, take very seriously.
Okay, and Mel, do you have any further observations you'd like to add? Unmute yourself if you do.
I will. I wanted to say one thing to Tommy, I guess, not to Tommy personally, but to the legislature. This idea of spending those hours on a liquor license transfer, it kind of to me begs the question: is the state really appropriately controlling liquor licensing? Our liquor licensing structure is based on after Prohibition. And, so there continues to be a lot of state control over liquor licensing. And, so is there a point in time where the legislature just, eliminates its paternalistic, approach towards liquor licensing? A few years ago, we had this municipal modernization bill, which I thought was really cool. it was a lot of details, a lot of sort of the nuts and bolts of governing, but it really were a lot of the source of some of these home rule petitions, whether it was a technical municipal finance issue or something else. So sometimes I think the legislature should say, let's look at our home rule petitions, and maybe there is a way, to address the things that keep coming up more globally. And I'm sure they do that and thinking about that. But that's one point I want to make in particular. And thank you very much for that.
I appreciate that. And I would add that the history of liquor licenses is actually a little uglier than you mentioned. Many historians have said the reason that the state liquor licenses is so the WASPs from the suburbs could prevent the Irish in Boston from getting drunk so much. That's a really obnoxious statement. It's also entirely believable, right? And that's sort of the historical basis, the bigoted historical basis for the law. But sometimes laws may have ugly histories and still not be terrible laws. I think there are arguments both ways on this particular issue, and I think it's worth us thinking about it every, 10 years, or we should keep revisiting it and asking ourselves, hey, this bureaucracy that we've created around this issue, is it still serving the public well? I don't have the sort of depth of experience in professional licensure to answer that question well, but I think it's a great question to ask. It's totally fair to ask that question, and I promise you, I will raise it. It's not the first time that Chair Taki Chan, the chair of professional licensure, has heard that question, perhaps this week. So it's fair. It's a fair question.
We have another question in the chat, and I think actually this may be one Mel can give a direct answer to. And the question is, which local bylaws did our Attorney General not approve lately? And I don't know whether Mel or Tommy will be able to answer that.
There's obviously one that comes on both of our minds, and it had to do with the fossil fuel-free modifications to building, local building. Tommy.
Yeah, so Warrant Article 21, which I think was passed, I'm going to say November 2019 or something like that.
Probably, yeah.
Essentially said you could not install any fossil fuel piping in new construction or substantial renovations, which was a clever way to prevent new construction from using fossil fuel heating systems. It exempted cooking. It had several other exemptions, but it was a clever way to say, hey, new buildings need to be electrified because, well, climate change is real and heating systems last a long time. And so we can't be using them anymore. And it was really sound logic from an economic and environmental perspective. Attorney General Healy ruled that it was in violation of 3 different state laws that relate to utilities. Towns are not allowed to make certain kinds of restrictions on public utilities because public utilities serve a greater regional or statewide good, and individual cities and towns could be very NIMBY, very not in my backyard, or very parochial, and really cause dire consequences in other communities. So the Attorney General ruled that Warrant Article 21, she said, like, this is a good idea. I'm sorry, though, it's not legal. And I responded to that. I responded to that very quickly and frankly, effectively. The legislature, the House in particular, passed a climate bill, the roadmap bill, and the Attorney General made this ruling in June of 2020. In July of 2020, the House was considering a large climate bill called the roadmap bill, and I filed an amendment that said, hey, if it's legal if the legislature says it's legal, right? And the Attorney General was clear about that. It's not legal today based on the current laws, but the legislature can change the laws. So I said, hey, that's what I do for a living. Why don't I try? And so we tried to change the laws and say, well, let's make it legal. Let's allow municipalities to opt in to this sort of process, not just Brookline via a home rule, but this issue is not substantially local in nature. All 351 cities and towns are in the same circumstance. So let's make a statewide law that would allow communities to opt in. That idea, being exactly a week old, did not have the momentum to pass on the floor, right? Most of my colleagues had never heard of this. And I raced around to talk with as many as possible. This is pre-COVID, right? So we were talking in person. Yeah, so it was so this would have been 2019. Yeah, this would have been, November 2018, and then June and July 2019. I apologize. But it didn't have the momentum. So it was not included in the House. However, the conference committee, which released the bill in very early January 2020, a week before, 4 days before session expired, included this idea in the conference bill, which we then passed into law. Governor Baker pocket vetoed, we passed again, Governor Baker vetoed, and then we passed it again, and now it's the law. And so this was an example where Brookline passed a home rule. The Attorney General said, sorry, it wasn't a home rule, excuse me, Brookline passed a bylaw. Sorry, it's not legal. It would either require general law or a home rule. And because the concept really is a general law concept, it's not sufficiently local, substantially local in nature. The legislature considered via my amendment and then ultimately passed a statewide law, effectively, not exactly, but effectively allowing the very idea that Brookline passed as a town bylaw that was ruled not consistent with state law by the Attorney General.
So sometimes you initiate something that has no chance or fails that can be implemented in a different kind of way, following a different path.
That's right, but I would just sort of point out that in this case, number one, it wasn't clear if the AGO was going to rule for or against. There were legal minds who thought one way or the other way. It wasn't obvious. There wasn't any sort of clear expectation. And number two, Brookline very much asked for what it wanted, right? It was very clear in what the town wanted, was told no. And then a member of the Great and General Court who just happened to represent Brookline, took it to the state. As Janice points out, town meeting did pass a second version that relies on zoning rather than the general bylaws. And the Attorney General has not yet ruled as to whether or not it stands the test of federal law, MGL, federal constitution, and state constitution. I do want to actually give you just a little bit more context. So the city of the town of Arlington, I think it's Arlington, is a city, and they have a law, a local law that says if you build a building, I think it's of a specific size, if you build a substantial building, you have to put on solar panels. You have to. That, maybe it's not Arlington then, it's definitely a city, it's not a town, because they didn't have to go before the Attorney General. You're right, Arlington is definitely a town. I don't remember, it's on the other side of the river, and it's not Cambridge. And
there's several over there.
I spend my time on this side of the river. It didn't have to go before the Attorney General, it's the law. And it's almost certainly in conflict with MGL. Almost certainly.
Interesting.
But someone with standing would have to sue the town to get it overturned. And the folks with standing are developers. And what they have figured out is it's cheaper to put the solar panels on the roof than it is to take the city to court. So they just put the solar panels on the roof, right? Like their goal is to build a building in a reasonably short number of years and make money doing it. And they figured out that they'll make more money if they just put the panels on than if they fight the fight. And so it's one of these really strange edge cases where the city has sort of like, threaded this needle. Most of the time what happens is someone challenges the city spends money defending the law, and they don't have the wind in their sails of the AGO has already looked at this and approved it. And so it is true that there's a difference between cities and towns with respect to local laws. It's not clear to me whether you'd rather be a city or rather be a town in this circumstance. It stinks to have to wait a couple of months for the Attorney General's ruling, but that ruling gives you much more confidence, should you go to court, that you're going to win and win more efficiently. Cities are kind of on their own. Sometimes you get this really unusual circumstance where they thread the needle and get a win. Most of the time, though, I think, you know, they like all governments, they spend money on internal counsel and outside counsel, and they, you know, you hash it out in court. That's what the courts are for.
Okay, well, I think we probably should do a little bit of a wrap here. Are there any other questions from folks who are present? I don't have any more in the chat. So I will just simply say thank you to Mel and to Tommy. You've helped understand. It's complicated. We knew it was complicated, and frankly, I'm not sure after this it feels any less complicated. But I will say this, what you've illustrated, which is very useful, I think, to many of us, that is that you can initiate something in a municipality that may not be accepted directly because of the municipal conditions and home rule. But on the other hand, the concept may become significant and important, and therefore the legislature will take action that affects everybody in a favorable way. So it's not, I guess I'm going to say, it should not discourage us from putting forward items that might not be approved specifically to Brookline if over time they actually benefit the entire Commonwealth. And that actually is, it's worth putting the effort into. So,
and Betsy, could I just add one more thing? I apologize.
Sure.
I should have said it earlier. We're a town, which means any resident of the town, perhaps any registered voter in the town, can offer a warrant article for town meetings consideration, and takes 10 signatures. It's
Right.
very easy to require the town meeting to consider one's idea. If you are thinking, anyone watching, are thinking about doing a home rule, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to myself, Senator Cindy Cream, or both, and not 2 days before you're going to file the warrant article. Reach out to us with enough time so that we can be helpful to you in crafting language that is most likely to be appropriate and effective. And sometimes it's as simple as getting the preamble right. There's 3 different kinds of preambles. One preamble is the loosest. It gives the legislature the most flexibility in editing the bill so that it meets the legislative standards. And that's one that I encourage petitioners to use, and I'm happy to provide that language. And
so you're saying drafting is important and people should get guidance on that.
It's critically important. So yeah, working with a legislator who is going to file the home rule and work very hard to get it passed before you file that home rule locally is probably a better strategy to get success. And since these warrant articles and eventually home rules require substantial effort from a lot of people, it's worth trying to do the best we can to make them successful.
Well, we appreciate your effort and are very interested as we go forward to see how many of the warrant articles that are coming up in November will be fully accepted and finally processed at the legislative level. Mel, do you have any final comments you'd like to add?
No, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to Mel and to Tommy both. I do think we have a better understanding, and we are certainly equally convinced, I believe, that we started off saying it was complicated, and I don't think I've changed my ideas about that personally one bit. So more to come, but we appreciate the help and education, and we'll look forward to hearing more as we go forward, and certainly to see what happens to the current town meetings warrant articles. Thank you all, and farewell.